For nearly half a century, Don Henley stood at the absolute center of one of the most powerful, calculated, and enduring juggernauts in American musical history. He was a figure universally defined by his fierce discipline, intense artistic control, and an almost impenetrable wall of emotional restraint. Yet when Glenn Frey died on January 18, 2016, something completely unprecedented occurred within the rock ecosystem. Henley went entirely quiet, and that sudden vacuum-like silence became far louder, more disruptive, and more deeply unsettling than any stadium anthem the Eagles had ever produced during their legendary run. Devastated fans waited anxiously, industry critics speculated wildly, and the global community wondered what possible words could follow the permanent loss of a brother, a fierce rival, and a creative equal. When the drummer finally broke his silence, it wasn't merely conventional grief that he revealed to the world. It was a raw, unfiltered truth that would forever reshape how we understand the inner mechanics of the Eagles. His eventual words pulled back the curtain on a legendary partnership, forever altering how the world perceived their timeless catalog, their notorious backstage warfare, and the complex human bond that held them together until the very end. When Glenn Frey passed away, a significant portion of the cultural landscape felt like it ground to a sudden, painful halt. The news of his passing reverberated with shocking speed across the globe, not simply because Frey was a wealthy celebrity, but because his distinctive vocal delivery and sharp songwriting sensibilities had lived deeply inside the personal lives of millions for decades. As a founding member of the Eagles, he wasn't just a singer or a guitar player. He was the primary architect of the band's signature West Coast swagger, their flawless melodic instincts, and their unwavering commercial confidence. His sudden death occurred after a brutal series of health complications that the public mistakenly believed were entirely manageable and under control, making the ultimate shockwave feel incredibly deep and intensely personal. For the casual fan listening to the radio, the loss felt incredibly abrupt, like a sudden tear in the fabric of classic rock history. For the inner circle who truly knew the man, the reality of his absence felt completely surreal, leaving an immediate, agonizing void that no one was prepared to fill. Almost immediately following the announcement, an overwhelming wave of public tributes poured in from every conceivable corner of the global entertainment industry. Fellow legendary musicians shared raw, unscripted memories, radio stations instantly shifted their programming to continuous Eagles marathons, and social media platforms became completely saturated with lyrics, vintage photographs, and deeply personal fan stories. Frey was universally remembered as the visionary who helped define an entire era of American rock music, crafting songs that brilliantly captured both the intoxicating freedom and the hidden, corrosive costs of pursuing the great American dream. Yet, amid all this overwhelming public noise, tribute concerts, and media analysis, the one voice that arguably mattered the most was completely missing from the conversation. Don Henley, the individual who had shared the physical stage, the high-pressure recording studio, and over 40 years of intense creative friction with Frey, said absolutely nothing to the press. Days dragged on into weeks, and this total, glaring absence of a formal statement from the remaining leader of the band gradually transformed into a massive, independent news story of its own. This was never a casual relationship between two ordinary bandmates who simply shared a tour bus. Henley and Frey were forever locked together in the public imagination, even during periods when they could barely tolerate being in the same room together behind closed doors. They functioned as the twin pillars of the Eagles, the volatile creative engine that drove every single aspect of the band's trajectory, from their meteoric early success to their spectacularly bitter 1980 collapse and their eventual multi-million-dollar reunion. Now that exactly one half of that legendary engine was permanently gone, the public began to speculate wildly about what the silence truly meant. Some observers genuinely believed Henley was simply too emotionally shattered to construct a coherent sentence, while others wondered if decades of unresolved internal tensions had rendered genuine words impossible to find. The intricate history between the two men was notoriously complicated, defined by intense professional rivalry, relentless power struggles, and prolonged periods of cold silence even while both were healthy and alive. What made this particular silence so deeply unsettling to historians was that it broke Henley's established lifelong pattern of maintaining complete narrative control through carefully crafted public statements. Behind the closed doors of their private circles, those who genuinely understood Henley recognized a deeper truth that the general public completely failed to grasp. Grief was not a corporate product that Henley was willing to rush out for a news cycle, especially when it concerned the most defining relationship of his professional life. Frey's untimely death was not merely the tragic loss of an old business partner. It was the permanent departure of the only true witness to Henley's entire journey into adulthood and superstardom. They had climbed together from absolute obscurity, endured the maddening pressures of global fame, completely destroyed their own band through excess, and miraculously rebuilt it into an empire decades later. To speak too quickly or offer a hollow, public relations-approved cliché would, in Henley's mind, cheapen something sacred and reduce a lifelong brotherhood into a momentary piece of disposable internet content. And so, despite the mounting pressure from media outlets and anxious fans, the legendary singer chose to wait, forcing the world to sit uncomfortably within the heavy silence. Long before the era of sold-out stadium tour, multi-million-dollar lawsuits and agonizing silence, Don Henley and Glenn Frey were just two completely unknown young musicians desperately trying to survive in the concrete jungle of Los Angeles. In the very early days of the 1970s, they inhabited the modest neighborhood of Echo Park, crammed into small, poorly insulated apartments surrounded by a community of equally hungry, struggling singer-songwriters. It was an environment completely devoid of glamour or financial security. Rent was cheap, future success was highly statistical, and a fierce unspoken ambition filled every single room. Frey would often recount in later years how incredibly close they all lived to one another, sharing spaces with the likes of J.D. Souther and Jackson Browne, each artist relentlessly chasing a creative vision they could barely define but completely refuse to abandon. Henley had arrived in Southern California from Texas, carrying a deep sense of artistic discipline, internal introspection, and a literary mindset that naturally processed the world through complex lyrical themes. Frey, conversely, arrived from Detroit radiating a raw, hustler-like confidence and an insatiable hunger for commercial impact, viewing the world through the lens of infectious melodies, pop hooks, and unstoppable momentum. From the very beginning of their interaction, their core personalities were fundamentally different, yet it was precisely this psychological contrast that created the intense creative friction necessary to spark something monumental. They did not initially become close friends because they shared similar outlooks on life. Rather, they became fierce allies because they recognized that they deeply needed each other's specific strengths to survive. Their historic partnership truly solidified while working inside the backing band for country rock icon Linda Ronstadt, where both young men quickly realized that their combined talents possessed a far greater potential than anything either could build as a solo act. Henley's unique, raspy vocal delivery carried a profound emotional weight and a sense of weary wisdom, while Frey's sharp commercial instincts and stage presence provided the necessary direction and driving force. When they finally decided to break away and form the Eagles, that delicate psychological balance became the bedrock upon which an entire musical empire was constructed. One partner was constantly pushing inward toward artistic depth and existential questioning, while the other was relentlessly pushing forward toward mass accessibility and stadium-sized impact. In the initial chapters of the band's career, this unique creative duality functioned with near-perfect efficiency, bringing them massive commercial success with a speed that quickly generated immense pressure. Henley would later openly admit to interviewers that this sudden, overwhelming success actually terrified him far more than the prospect of artistic failure ever could. Getting to the top of the music industry was not the most difficult challenge, he discovered. The true agony lay in trying to maintain that position while the entire world watched your every move. Every single hit single they released created a mountain of new expectations, and every subsequent album carried the immense, exhausting weight of the one that came before it. This crushing psychological pressure did not distribute itself equally upon the two leaders, causing their fundamental differences to amplify significantly over time. Frey was an individual who genuinely thrived on continuous movement, high-speed decision-making, and navigating the immediate energy of the rock and roll lifestyle. Henley, by contrast, desperately wanted to slow the machinery down, meticulously questioning every creative choice and fiercely resisting anything that felt artistically shallow or commercially rushed. Life on the endless touring circuits of the 1970s dramatically magnified these underlying personality rifts, transforming the Eagles into a band globally synonymous with extreme rock and roll excess. Their backstage world became a blur of destroyed hotel suites, volatile relationships, and massive parties that regularly bled into late afternoons. Yet even when surrounded by total hedonistic chaos, there was a strict professional boundary that neither Henley nor Frey would ever allow the band to cross. Frey famously joked in retrospect that they were highly functioning party animals, but the golden rule was that no one was ever permitted to miss a scheduled recording session or soundcheck. They always showed up to do the work, ensuring that the integrity of the music remained the absolute priority above personal indulgence. This deeply ingrained shared value held the two men together in a tight professional grip long after their genuine personal friendship had completely eroded. Their songwriting collaboration became one of the most prolific and commercially dominant partnerships in the history of American rock music, capturing something deeply uncomfortable about the culture they inhabited. When discussing the creation of their most iconic material, Henley frequently explained that their songs were never just about physical locations or superficial narratives. They were complex, dark metaphors exploring the dark underbelly of the celebrated American dream, exposing the heavy psychological price that immense wealth and success demanded from individuals. Frey entirely supported this cynical artistic vision, utilizing his melodic genius to make these dark, challenging themes incredibly palatable to mainstream radio audiences. However, as the Eagles grew into a multi-million-dollar corporate entity, the fragile balance of power between the two co-founders began to experience a dangerous shift. Band leadership became a constantly contested territory, and creative control emerged as the primary currency within their deteriorating relationship. The exact same personality differences that had once rendered their initial partnership so remarkably powerful were now hardening into rigid, unyielding lines that neither man was willing to cross. Still, during this highly lucrative era, neither individual could truly conceive of an artistic existence without the other being present, as they were actively building something far too massive to walk away from. Part 2. By the time the Eagles reached the absolute zenith of their global fame in the late 1970s, the collective was no longer fueled by raw artistic hunger or youthful camaraderie. Instead, the entire operation was driven by a relentless, exhausting obsession with control, a shift accelerated by the staggering commercial performance of their previous records. The delicate equal partnership that had defined their early days in Echo Park had slowly degraded into an ongoing high-stakes political negotiation where every single creative decision carried a hidden layer of psychological warfare. The recording studio was transformed from a sanctuary of collaboration into a tense, claustrophobic battleground where Henley's demand for perfection consistently collided with Frey's drive for efficiency. Henley had grown increasingly meticulous, establishing a reputation as a brutal perfectionist who demanded endless vocal takes, re-engineered drum tracks for weeks, and refused to finalize a lyric until every syllable carried a profound weight. For Henley, the music had become an immense moral responsibility, an artistic statement where words and underlying meaning were matters of life and death. Frey viewed the creative process through a completely different psychological lens, firmly believing that maintaining creative momentum and emotional energy was just as vital as achieving intellectual depth. To his mind, Henley's obsessive overthinking was actively killing the spontaneous rock and roll energy of the tracks, and endless revision was simply draining the vital human life out of the performance. What Henley confidently labeled as artistic discipline and commitment to excellence, Frey began to openly resent as absolute obstruction and ego-driven control. This profound philosophical divide reached a critical breaking point during the exhausting multi-month recording sessions for what would become their ultimate defining studio album. By this stage in the band's evolution, Henley had fully transitioned into the role of the Eagles' primary creative voice, both literally and thematically. He performed the lead vocals on the vast majority of the album's most crucial radio-defining tracks, deliberately shaping the overall mood of the band into something significantly darker, more cynical, and deeply reflective. Frey, who had comfortably dominated the public spotlight and driven the band's early identity, suddenly found himself pushed closer to the creative periphery of his own group. His intense frustration was impossible to mask, as he watched the band drift away from its energetic country rock roots and slide into a colder, highly polished, and emotionally restrained sonic landscape. Bitter arguments over minor musical arrangements became an established part of their daily routine, and expensive studio sessions dragged on fruitlessly through the night. The remaining members of the band were frequently forced to sit idly for days while Henley endlessly refined subtle audio details that Frey considered completely irrelevant to a rock audience. The resulting psychological tension was so overwhelming that even outside sound engineers and studio visitors could feel the thick, suffocating atmosphere immediately upon entering the room. What made this internal conflict so tragic and completely unresolvable was that both men genuinely believed they were acting in the absolute best interest of the Eagles' longevity. Frey was entirely convinced that maintaining commercial accessibility and melodic hooks was what kept the Eagles alive in the fast-moving marketplace. Henley, on the other hand, was equally convinced that a serious, uncompromising artistic depth was the only thing that would grant their music true permanence across generations. Neither individual was willing to yield an inch of ground, transforming every track into an exhausting war of attrition that pushed their relationships to the brink. The collateral damage of this executive power struggle did not stop with the two co-founders, as the other musicians in the band began to physically and mentally fracture under the weight of their dominance. Creative disagreements quickly mutated into deeply personal vendettas, mutual professional patience completely vanished from the dynamic, and interpersonal trust eroded quietly, one midnight argument at a time. The band was undeniably still producing some of the most extraordinary, timeless music of the 20th century, but the severe human cost of that output was becoming visible in every single awkward interaction. When the grueling recording process was finally completed, the finished album presented a flawless, beautifully unified sonic front to the world. But behind that auditory illusion, the band was in utter ruins. The massive commercial success and critical acclaim that followed the release served as a massive corporate mask, hiding a highly volatile internal environment that was rapidly heading toward a catastrophic collapse. What began as a series of healthy creative tensions in the early 70s had officially spilled over into open, unadulterated hostility as the decade drew to a close. Nowhere was this profound deterioration more painfully visible than on the exhausting global stadium tour that followed their massive record releases. By the turn of the decade, the members of the Eagles were no longer experiencing the joy of performing music together. They were simply enduring one another's physical presence for the duration of a contract. Years of completely unresolved resentment, intense power struggles, and severely bruised egos had accumulated into a toxic weight, and the live stage became the very last place where these explosive human emotions could be contained. The overwhelming psychological pressure of this arrangement affected every single person on the payroll, creating a deeply unstable working environment for everyone involved. Musicians who were not part of the central Henley power dynamic found themselves trapped between two completely immovable forces, forced to constantly navigate a minefield of shifting alliances. One by one, the supporting members began to crack under the strain, turning to various forms of substance abuse or explosive outbursts to cope with the suffocating atmosphere. Long before the final public collapse occurred, glaring warning signs of an impending disaster appeared regularly throughout their global itineraries. The band's internal environment had grown so incredibly toxic that loyalty became entirely conditional, and old friendships were replaced by transactional business arrangements. Brief moments of professional restraint completely gave way to public arguments that could no longer be dismissed by management as mere tour stress or physical exhaustion. The definitive historical breaking point finally arrived during a highly publicized benefit concert in Long Beach, California, near the absolute end of a tour that was already completely fraying at the seams. The backstage tension, which had been simmering at a dangerous boil for months, instantly ignited over a perceived discourtesy involving a political guest and his family. What should have been a completely minor, easily dismissed social interaction instantly became an explosive catalyst for decades of pent-up hatred between Glenn Frey and guitarist Don Felder. Frey's blinding rage followed him directly onto the live stage, and as the band performed their flawless, complex vocal harmonies for thousands of oblivious fans, literal death threats were exchanged through clenched teeth between songs. The massive crowd heard nothing but beautiful, sun-drenched California melodies, while the individual musicians on stage felt a terrifying internal countdown ticking away toward the absolute end of their careers. That single, agonizing performance revealed exactly what the Eagles had truly become behind the famous rock and roll myth. They were no longer a functioning musical brotherhood. They were a highly volatile human pressure cooker that was completely incapable of safely venting its internal stress. Every single live performance had transformed into a grueling legal obligation rather than an expression of artistic joy, with every famous guitar solo carrying a heavy baggage of history, resentment, and profound emotional exhaustion. For Don Henley, standing behind his drum kit witnessing this public disintegration, the sudden realization was both deeply devastating and completely undeniable. The intricate organizational structure that had held their massive musical empire together for nearly a decade had permanently collapsed, leaving absolutely no emotional space left to repair the damage. When that final, disastrous tour officially concluded, the executive decision to dissolve the partnership was made quietly behind closed doors before the general public even realized what had occurred. When the formal announcement of the breakup was finally delivered to the media, it was presented with a level of blunt, unpolished honesty that shocked the music industry. The historic breakup of the Eagles was not a peaceful, amicable parting of ways between mature artists. It was a brutal, deeply traumatizing severing of ties that left everyone involved severely scarred. Years of intense, high-pressure collaboration had pushed the individual members far beyond the limits of human psychological tolerance, transforming what once felt like a beautiful brotherhood into a desperate battle for personal survival. Henley would later reflect deeply on this dark period, noting that rock bands typically form when young men are intensely vulnerable, financially insecure, and completely unsure of their place in the world. In those early chapters, a powerful shared ambition binds individuals together into a tight, fiercely loyal unit capable of conquering the entire entertainment industry. However, as those same individuals grow older, achieve immense wealth, and develop distinct adult identities, that exact same forced closeness can become an incredibly suffocating cage. The Eagles had officially reached that critical evolutionary point, where every single member desperately required physical distance, personal autonomy, and permanent relief from the relentless friction of the collective. The grand, shared dream that had sustained them through the lean years of Echo Park had officially become completely unsustainable under the weight of its own massive success. The timeless music they had created never once stopped playing on global radio stations, serving as a permanent soundtrack to the lives of millions, but the actual men who had bled in the studio to create those tracks walked completely away from one another. For more than a consecutive decade, Henley and Frey existed in completely separate worlds, utterly refusing to engage in direct communication. They remained permanently connected by complex corporate contracts, massive publishing rights, and an overwhelming mountain of unresolved emotional history, but they were deeply separated by an impenetrable wall of personal pride and sheer exhaustion. Both men immediately launched highly successful solo careers, proving to the world that they could thrive independently, yet the giant shadow of the Eagles continued to loom over everything they touched. Part 3. For 14 long years following their spectacular public demise, Don Henley and Glenn Frey navigated their creative lives in completely parallel, highly insulated universes. Both individuals successfully built multi-platinum solo brands, dominated the Billboard charts independently, and deliberately avoided uttering a single kind or conciliatory word about the other in the media. The deep-seated bitterness and competitive jealousy that had fueled their initial breakup never truly disappeared from their psychological makeup. It simply manifested in different ways. Expensive entertainment lawyers routinely handled what human words could no longer accomplish, transforming corporate royalties, licensing rights, and catalog control into a continuous legal battleground long after the physical band had ceased to exist. Publicly, both artists repeatedly and fiercely insisted to reporters that the Eagles would only reunite when hell permanently froze over, a statement that became a definitive mantra for their generational divide. Privately, however, the slow, quiet passage of time and the shifting realities of the music industry were performing their inevitable work on both men's perspectives. When the historic reunion finally materialized in 1994, it was absolutely not born from a sudden wave of genuine personal reconciliation or healed emotional wounds. Instead, the monumental return was calculated with cold precision, driven by a mature recognition of their shared legacy and a sheer exhaustion with their independent paths. The monumental decision to resurrect the Eagles did not erase a single line of their toxic history. It simply acknowledged the undeniable reality that the music they created together was infinitely larger than their personal conflicts. When the band officially gathered to rehearse for their historic MTV acoustic special, Glenn Frey immediately and unapologetically took absolute, firm control of the business infrastructure and corporate operations. The new operational rules were incredibly clear, completely non-negotiable, and meticulously structured by legal teams to prevent the volatile power struggles of the 1970s from ever resurfacing. Don Henley deliberately chose to accept this highly corporate arrangement, not because his old emotional scars had miraculously healed, but because he understood that the alternative was a permanent artistic silence. The resulting Hell Freezes Over reunion tour was a staggering, history-making triumph that completely shattered box office records and reminded the world of their unmatched musical dominance. Global fans celebrated wildly, stadium venues sold out within minutes, and the band's flawless live harmonies sounded as pristine and effortless as they had 2 decades prior. Yet behind the bright stadium lights and the corporate sponsorships, the core relationship between Henley and Frey remained incredibly guarded. Highly transactional and strictly managed. They were no longer the passionate, wide-eyed brothers who had shared a cheap apartment in Echo Park and dreamed of changing the world through rock music. They had evolved into highly sophisticated corporate partners who maintained incredibly rigid personal boundaries and communicated almost exclusively through professional filters. Every single piece of internal communication was handled with extreme care, and every major business decision was deliberate, cold, and calculated to avoid triggering old resentments. The band had successfully learned how to function with maximum corporate efficiency, without ever reopening the deep psychological scars that had destroyed their youth. Over the course of the next 2 consecutive decades, they continuously toured the globe, recorded select new material, and meticulously preserved the Eagles as a massive living cultural legacy. Yet those individuals who existed within their immediate inner circle understood the profound, underlying human truth of the arrangement. The genuine warmth, spontaneous camaraderie and deep creative trust of their early years never truly returned to the relationship. What existed in its place was a profound, unshakable mutual respect, earned through a shared history of survival and the sobering recognition that neither man could ever erase the other from his life's defining work. They were locked in a permanent artistic marriage, bound together by a catalog of music that had defined the American experience for an entire generation of listeners. When Don Henley finally broke his long, agonizing media silence following Glenn Frey's sudden passing in 2016, it was immediately apparent to the world that his words were not a standard public relations statement written for media headlines. It was a raw, deeply vulnerable piece of writing born from a state of psychological survival and profound existential shock. He spoke slowly, with an intense, deliberate gravity, openly admitting to the public that he was still actively processing the terrifying reality of the loss, and that it would take a significant portion of his remaining life to truly understand what had occurred. Frey's tragic death, he explained with heartbreaking candor, had arrived with a suddenness that completely shattered his emotional defenses. While there had been a series of ongoing health struggles behind the scenes, the inner circle had been led to believe that the situation was entirely stable and under control. The sheer speed of the loss left absolutely no time for emotional preparation, no opportunity for a final private conversation, and no space to resolve the complex tensions that had remained unaddressed for years. Henley did not attempt to present himself to the global media as a man who had found closure or peace with the situation. Instead, he spoke openly as a man completely stunned and paralyzed by a massive echoing absence that had suddenly redefined his world. Frey was not merely a former business partner or a talented guitar player with whom he had shared a stage. He was the one absolute, unwavering constant across every single chapter of Henley's adult existence. The meteoric rise to fame, the terrifying depths of substance abuse, the spectacular public collapse, and the triumphant corporate resurrection, Frey had been there for all of it. Without Frey's living presence in the world, Henley was suddenly left completely alone as the sole remaining custodian of memories that only two human beings on Earth had ever shared. That profound realization of total isolation, far more than any considerations of fame, wealth, or musical legacy, was what ultimately broke through Henley's legendary wall of emotional restraint. What truly shocked and deeply moved millions of listeners worldwide was Henley's absolute, unvarnished honesty regarding the notorious volatility of their lifelong relationship. He refused to participate in the common cultural practice of rewriting history, to pretend that their partnership had been easy, harmonious, or peaceful. He openly acknowledged the fierce creative conflicts, the exhausting power struggles, and the bitter midnight arguments that had defined their interaction for nearly half a century. Yet in the very same breath, he made something unmistakably and beautifully clear to the entire world. None of those conflicts had ever erased the deep, foundational bond of love between them. He passionately described Frey as his true brother, the indispensable spark plug of the entire organization, and the unstoppable human engine that kept the Eagles moving forward even when everything threatened to collapse into chaos. Henley revealed intimate historical moments that the general public had never fully understood or appreciated during the band's heyday. He noted with deep gratitude that it was actually Frey who had fiercely pushed him to the front of the stage during their early days in Linda Ronstadt's band, relentlessly insisting that Henley sing lead vocals on complex tracks that Henley himself completely doubted he had the ability to deliver. Frey had possessed an absolute, unwavering belief in the power and unique emotional weight of Henley's voice long before Henley had developed that confidence in himself. That single act of selfless artistic encouragement permanently shaped the entire sonic identity of the Eagles, altering the trajectory of popular music and changing Henley's life forever. It was an immense, lifelong creative debt that the legendary drummer openly admitted he could never possibly repay to his fallen partner. Perhaps the most devastatingly honest admission in the entire statement arrived when Henley addressed the uncertain future of the band. He stated plainly and without sentimentality that without Glenn Frey's physical presence, there was no longer any version of the Eagles as the world had known it. The historic songs could certainly continue to be played on the radio, and the remaining musicians could choose to perform on stage, but the core creative partnership that animated the entire enterprise was gone forever. When the agonizing executive decision was eventually made to continue touring under the Eagles' banner years later, it was absolutely not designed as an act of replacement or commercial exploitation. The deliberate choice to bring Glenn Frey's young son, Deacon Frey, onto the global stadium stage was conceived entirely as a deeply emotional gesture of historical continuity and familial respect, rather than a cynical substitution. It functioned as a beautiful living way to honor Frey's monumental contribution to American culture, ensuring that his memory was actively kept alive rather than erased by the passage of time. Don Henley and Glenn Frey built an entirely timeless musical universe through a volatile mixture of intense friendship, fierce professional conflict, and immense personal sacrifice. Their legendary body of work stands as a permanent monument to the reality that true artistic greatness is rarely achieved through peaceful harmony. Rather, it is forged in the intense heat of creative friction, rivalry, and an unbreakable human bond.